Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Sysdig. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting program ahead, but before we get things started, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First of all, we are recording today's session. So if you'd like to watch at a later point in time, or if you'd like to share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the on-demand recording shortly after we conclude this session today. Now, if you'd like to engage with us, engage with your fellow audience members, there's a couple ways to do so. The first option is the chat tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. So if you see that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you are joining us. If you have any specific questions, and we do have time at the end of this session for a live Q&A, please do send your questions in and we will be sure to address them toward the end of our period of webinar. If you jump over to that handouts tab, you'll see there are a whole lot of resources there for you. So please take advantage, grab as many of those as you can. Perfect. So to introduce today's topic, we are discussing cloud security turbocharged, a wild ride of innovation, threats, and staying ahead. And I'm joined today by Michael Izbitsky, Director of Cybersecurity Strategy at Sysdig. And we're also joined by Crystal Morin, Cybersecurity Strategist at Sysdig. So Crystal and Michael, thank you both for joining us today. Let's go ahead and get this conversation rolling.
Today, we're going to be talking a lot about cloud security issues. We're going to move through this pretty fast, right? Because it's kind of the world of cloud, right? Cloud, the speed of cloud, right? And security issues happen quite quickly in cloud. So today, you're going to be hearing from myself, Mike Izbitsky, Director of Cybersecurity Strategy here at Sysdig, and I am joined by my colleague, Crystal Warren. Crystal, do you want to introduce yourselves to the audience?
Yeah, hi, my name is Crystal, and I am a cybersecurity strategist, formerly a threat research engineer here at Sysdig.
All right, awesome. So let's get into it. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. All of the events are much better. If we can kind of personalize this for your set of problems, right? Everybody's world is a little unique, whether it's people, process, or technology. So with that being said, let's kind of dive in. So security incidents occur at cloud speed. And actually, we see this in a lot of different industry research. This particular statistic comes from IBM Security and their cost of data breach report from 2022. And that's that 45% of breaches were actually cloud-based in 2022. So sometimes organizations will think, I'm not really using cloud, but the reality is your teams often are consuming cloud resources. Hopefully it's sanctioned stuff, but most organizations are working in cloud, right? Most organizations have also undergone digital transformation for some time now. Cloud is very integral to those kinds of initiatives. We also have seen very large scale breaches or incidents and breaches. We've seen Uber get hit multiple times, and sometimes I hate picking on Uber, right? Because Uber actually did a lot of things right. They have a very mature security program, but they weren't safe from cyber attacks, right? This can happen to any organization. Uber did a lot of things right, but it's a very good example of how quickly even a leading security organization can get attacked and compromised. So they were kind of owned within minutes, where the attacker got access to privileged credentials very quickly and were able to move laterally within the network. We're going to touch a little bit more on that too as we get through the session. And as IBM reported, 277 days was the average time to identify and contain the data breach, which is very, very long, right? Because we're talking about minutes for an attacker to compromise an entire network, steal data, own the accounts, own systems, right? They have their, it's full playground for them, right? And then it takes us that much longer to even know that something happened, right? Because there's an enormous amount of data that organizations have to sift through. So this is kind of reality, right? Incidents occur within minutes, but we're still measuring response time in months, which is very poor, right? And it's everybody kind of suffers from this, right? Because we don't always have the right tooling or process to deal with kind of the scale of the problem, right, or the speed of the problem. All right. With that being said, there's kind of 4 areas of security challenges that occur for organizations in cloud. One of them is that we're regularly working with vulnerable resources to start, right? And if you are on a container journey or deploying Kubernetes, not everybody is, right? We acknowledge that many organizations are kind of purely in cloud and using virtual machines, but this particular statistics comes from Sysdig's Cloud Security and Usage Report issued earlier this year. But we saw that 87% of container images actually have high or critical vulnerabilities, and this is specifically Sysdig customers, right? So these are organizations that already acknowledge they have a problem, and they're still seeing these issues, right? So what happens is you're sourcing images and components from other public registries and repositories. Those resources have latent vulnerabilities or CVE-IDs. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these as well, but that's kind of the current state of affairs, right? What we're starting from is known vulnerable. Configuration management or posture management, 99% of cloud breaches actually start with misconfigurations. This particular stat comes from Gartner specifically. Another Sysdig stat from the usage report is that we saw that 90% of granted cloud permissions aren't even used, right? So they're granted to accounts and then never used again, right? So that's a potential attack vector, kind of like the Uber example. And threat detection and response, really the thing that is highly impacting to TDR efforts or SecOps efforts is that containers are very short-lived, right? We talk a lot about how cloud is highly ephemeral. Cloud or container technology is really what is powering a lot of cloud or cloud-native environments. And those containers are very short-lived by design, but then also to satisfy business functionality, right? It becomes usually more efficient, cost efficient, and operationally efficient to run things as containers, but it creates new security challenges, particularly for your threat detection and response. All right, so what's happening in reality, right? There's kind of this split, right? We hear this a lot in industry with shift left and shield right. It's kind of where you're putting your areas of focus in your security program. Some of this is a little marketing heavy, the terminology, but it's a nice way of kind of thinking about where are you focusing your efforts. And it is kind of fundamental to security strategy. A lot of organizations are shifting left in their security because they want to identify known vulnerabilities and configuration problems prior to those things being deployed to running environments or production, right? Because it's eliminating your potential incident, right? That thing never got to the running environment. The problem is that the more you test, the more you start to unearth a lot of issues, right? And most organizations are still doing a mix of manual and automated approaches, right? You might be automating your security testing, but you're not always automating the response to that or your release decision, right? What is an acceptable threshold for vulnerabilities to allow that thing to release to production? Again, if you run any kind of security test, you're going to find CVE-IDs. It's inevitable, right? And if you think about the entire application portfolio and all the systems, you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of vulnerabilities in most cases, right? Depends on the size of your application portfolio, but it's not uncommon to see 1,000 findings for just even one application, right? And then if you think about the broader view of the organization, there's different teams focusing on different areas of problems. The teams handling shield right might be your network security function or a cloud security function, where shift left might be more DevOps personas. So there's very much the people kind of complexity to this, right? And then how do you structure your processes to identify all these issues, but then triage them in the right way? That kind of introduces the whole concept of time, right? And as we've been saying, like things in cloud happen very quickly, as do attacks. right? And if you are trying to coordinate response internally across all these different personas, gaps arise, right? So every organization kind of struggles with this. I've seen it in hundreds, if not thousands of hours of advisory work. It's a very common problem, right? It's not hard to find issues. It's hard to find them quickly and then address them quickly, right? And then how do you prioritize the work because you only have so much manpower? All right, and that's where this whole concept of runtime insights comes into play. Right, this is kind of the missing link, right? Because thinking back to that slide about shift left, we can run scanners, we can find all these issues, we can potentially automate them in our build pipelines. But then what do? Right, you have to correlate all of that information. You have to make risk determinations to know, well, what are the things that I'm actually going to work to remediate or mitigate. That's a lot of manual thought process, but also the work to fix all that. So you have to have automated ways to kind of analyze that, right? Help me to understand what is actually being used, right? Because if I have a package within an application that's never being used, that's probably not something I'm going to prioritize to remediate quickly. I might push that in the backlog or deal with it a week from now or 2 weeks from now, right? It's going to depend on criticality of that application or the exposure, right? There's a lot of variables there. And this is kind of the information that most practitioners and leaders and CISOs are looking for, is that there's only so many resources to go around. Yes, give me the telemetry so I know everything that's going on, but I need to know like really what's the most important, right? Because what am I going to do right now? What do I do tomorrow? What do I do a week from now? So that risk prioritization is absolutely fundamental. And that's what we at SysDig call runtime insights. Current state of vulnerability management is unfortunately kind of a car wreck or a train wreck. We're talking about the speed, right? If you think about delivery of applications and infrastructure, it's happening very rapidly. If you're doing any kind of deployment in, say, AWS, for instance, you're working with CloudFormation, maybe Terraform, you can spin up assets and tear them down extremely quickly. And then if you are in the world of Kubernetes, that's happening by design, right? That's container orchestration. So it's moving very fast. And if you think about a build pipeline or CI/CD, right, you can inject these scans to find things, but again, if you just found 1,000 CVE IDs in a collection of app code with the infrastructure as code, what do? Right? And not all of those are going to be first-party issues, right? Oftentimes it's open source dependencies you're working with, or a commercial vendor that's providing some piece of code or a system. Who's accountable for that, right? That's fundamental to security programs, is who's the owner to mitigate or remediate an issue. That's going to slow down release, right, or delivery, which really creates friction in digital transformation. And most organizations are looking for very, very quick release velocity. Even if you're not trying to deploy 10 times in a day, you still need to be able to deploy efficiently. Right? You don't want these kind of bottlenecks where you're finding things and now you have to engage teams. It just creates too much extra work or toil. And we have to remember that engineers are focusing on business requirements first and foremost, right? They need to deliver functionality. They have to maintain availability and uptime. Security is kind of always going to be secondary to that, right? It's not their primary mission. So we need to be providing tooling and process that kind of provides the right context and that security expertise where it doesn't necessarily exist. Right, Gartner started to call this cyber judgment, but it's really about, it's kind of, I've also heard the term self-service, but it's really equipping people with the right information, but also technology that they can very quickly and efficiently fix something, right? So ideally that might be fully automated, if you are kind of a leading class organization, but you need that information in real time or as close to it as possible because of speed of attacks. And Crystal, do you want to jump in here? I know this was kind of your baby for a while, the threat research.
Yes. Yeah. So this information you're looking at right here, it's a lot. I'm going to talk you through it right now. This came from the usage report as well. We got that 87% of images have critical or high vulnerabilities. And if you're running hundreds or thousands of images, that's pretty overwhelming, and your security teams aren't going to be able to effectively manage those vulnerabilities. So, which vulnerabilities actually matter? Which ones do you focus on and prioritize first? That 100% you're looking at right there, that's the 87%, right? So we're looking at all of these critical and high vulnerable images. What can we do to reduce that number? First, we looked at the number of vulnerabilities that had a fix available. So there's some kind of patch or something. The third-party vendor that you're obtaining this image from knows that they're an issue. They send out a patch or a code correction, and you're able to apply that no problem. That's still 71% of your vulnerabilities. That's still a lot to work on. If you consider the runtime insights, now you're looking at only 15% of your images are in use and have a vulnerability. That's probably the sweet spot where most organizations are going to sit. You are using these images, they have a vulnerability, you want to correct them, you should focus on that. This 2% exploitable, these are images with critical or high vulnerabilities. They have a CVE assigned to them, and there's an active POC. So, we always see those on Twitter or something like that. There's Log4j, the SolarWinds breach. We know that bad guys are using these vulnerabilities and they are compromising organizations. So that would be the most critical to fix. That means it's exploitable, it's active, and your organization has it in use. That's what you want to prioritize first, but ideally prioritizing that 15% of your images that are in use and have vulnerabilities is what you should be working to correct.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because it's a lot of organizations will think critical, right? That's if you think of like CVSS scoring, critical is always going to be the most critical, but this gives you another way of kind of slicing that information, right? And if you're thinking kind of tactically, well, I really want to address those things that are known to be exploitable and are actually being used, right? I do want to get all criticals, obviously, but I still have to take time to do that, right? I've seen plenty of SLAs or service level agreements on critical vulnerabilities that you get a week to fix that, right? We just talked about how organizations can get breached within minutes, right? So it's kind of an unacceptable SLA. So while it seems weird to say, well, why would you only focus on that 2%? You have to kind of think in terms of time, right? And again, that speed of cloud, that becomes the way that you can kind of organize your resources and tackle those really the most truly critical issues, not just what CVSS tells you is a critical finding.
Okay, so next up we have cloud permissions. This pertains to the entitlement management that we talked about earlier on. 90% of permissions are not used, are granted to employees and not used. So they're sitting out there. It's just more risk and opportunity for an attacker. The way that I like to frame this that helps it make a little bit more sense to me is downloading mobile apps on your cell phone. You know how when you first download an app, it always asks you to grant all of these permissions. I actually looked this one up last night, Candy Crush. We all know it, right? Just a game that we all like to waste time on. You've got 5 minutes between meetings, you're going to go play Candy Crush. Candy Crush actually asks for your location and also for a list of all the other apps on your phone, which they want to give you ads that pertain to what you're interested in, right? But this is just unnecessary due risk. You don't need to grant those permissions to go and play Candy Crush. It's the same thing with cloud accounts and the permissions granted to your employees. They may come and ask you for certain permissions so that they can work on a particular project. There's groups like, say, DevOps personnel, they're creating a new app or something like that, and they need administrator permissions to be able to ensure that they're building an app correctly, that they can span the environment. Once they're done with that project, those permissions should be removed. So just making sure that you're keeping up on your granted permissions, taking away permissions that are no longer actively used by your employees is going to greatly reduce your risk. An attacker is always looking for, obviously, first a means in. Once they're in your network, they want to move laterally. The best way that they can do that is picking an account and moving through that account, looking for administrator permissions and things like that. If you reduce the number of permissions that your accounts have to only what's required, you're going to reduce the attack surface as well.
Yeah, and one thing I like to stress here too, Crystal, is like oftentimes when we think in terms of identities, we're just thinking people or humans, right? And when you're talking about cloud and cloud native applications or systems, there's a lot more machine identities usually, or services as well, right? And those things need to be assigned some kind of credential. And it could take a lot of forms, right? It might be an API-based access. It might be something that's certificate-based, a mutual TLS, for instance. Right, so there's a lot of different types of credentials in play. It's not just employees and customers, which are distinctly different as well, right? So there's a really massive landscape of permissions that very quickly erupt in cloud, and it becomes almost unmanageable for most organizations without tooling to kind of give them the right information of how is this thing used, where is it used, has it been used recently, and a lot of attacks actually happen with attackers targeting identities. If not initially, that might be part of the attack chain, and sometimes as security practitioners we might dismiss an incident as like, they just kind of phished that person or social engineered them, but that is a very critical aspect of your security, right? It's not just ensuring that you're using vulnerability-free code or as close to that as possible. It's also making sure that you've defined access controls properly and set up permissions as part of zero trust architecture. All right, Crystal, configuration management, exciting topic.
Yeah, so regarding initial access, right? Like you said, Gartner found that 99% of cloud breaches start with a misconfiguration. This is mostly human error, right? We all make mistakes, and that's a really scary burden to hold. I know I wouldn't want to have to be in charge of configuration management and knowing that there is such a high possibility that there's going to be a compromise due to an error that myself or my team made. Permission management relates to this as well. The less permissions there are, the tighter that this configuration access is going to be. You don't want a lot of your employees to be able to make configurations and be able to make those mistakes. No amount of training can fix this problem. It's just something that we need to keep an eye on. Environments are mixed. You have multi-clouds. It's distributed. It's a difficult thing to get a grasp on.
Yeah, and a couple of things to add. Control planes, right? If you're not familiar with that concept, sometimes that pops up more in like network engineering language or network security. But as you're working with different environment types, each tech stack kind of has their own control plane or management layer, right? And you have to define all these access controls there and configurations. If you think about like a complete enterprise architecture, you're contending with multiple layers of those control planes, right? So misconfigurations, it's kind of like one of those things that's very simple, right? It's like, why is this number so high? Why don't people actually disable, port 80, which is another point I'll get to in a second. But why do these things happen? Well, it's partially because we have so many different spots we have to configure and manage things. That's kind of unavoidable, right? This isn't necessarily vendor product selection. This is just kind of the nature of the beast in how you create all of your infrastructure or the compute that powers it. And even if you're just purely in AWS, if you're also using Kubernetes and virtualization services, you're using multiple pieces of technology in AWS. Each has their own control plane. right? So you have to make sure your VPCs are configured correctly. That's one component. And then Kubernetes itself becomes a layer within that. So you have to make sure all those things are configured correctly for access control, as Crystal alluded to, right? They are very tightly intertwined. Sometimes people say misconfiguration, they're actually meaning mispermission or something related to access controls. But the other point I was bringing up about like ports, right? Because like, particularly in the network security space, if you think in terms of firewalls, there was kind of that tendency like, let's lock everything down, right? Because that's going to make it secure, right? And we should seek to do that, right? That is kind of least privilege and zero trust. But the reality is most applications or services or microservices, they need to be open or in some state of openness, right? And for network connectivity, that's typically 80 and 443. But they also need open access controls to talk to one another, right? And then we kind of get back to that entitlements discussion is, well, what's the appropriate access for that user or machine to that piece of code, right? So it's very hard to kind of define those access controls at scale and know what is the proper configuration for the infrastructure.
On to threat detection. Yes. Yep. So this stat from the usage report, 72% of containers that we saw lived less than 5 minutes. This environment is very ephemeral, things move very quickly, and this makes it very difficult for threat response teams to be able to capture the appropriate logs, to be able to see what's going on. This only gives you 5 minutes to witness the container spinning up and spinning back down, capture that activity that's going on. It also only gives 5 minutes for an attacker to be able to get into that container. But if they're already watching you, they've done their reconnaissance, they know maybe how often this container spins up and down. When it goes live, they're ready to attack. Like we said, cloud attacks are really fast. So this makes it very hard for threat detection teams. Attackers use AI to make things faster so that they can get into your environment within that 5 minutes. Threat detection needs to be able to use AI as well to be able to capture what's going on in that short time frame. What else do you have to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, a bit. We just want to be mindful of time too. So it's there's a few things in play here, right? Like the ephemerality is definitely important for threat detection and response. It's also really critical for auditing and governance, right? So there's many pieces to this, right? And that container stat it's really kind of mind blowing when you really think about that amount of time, just like it is with the time to breach, right? Or boom, right? So it's like we need to get ahead of that, and it's very short. Right. And like we need to retain all this data to support our auditing and governance. So yeah, the AI piece is newer. I mean, technology wise, not terribly new, but we're seeing more attackers use AI as a tool themselves, right? Just like how the world has woken up to LLMs like ChatGPT and seeing how they can incorporate that into their work. Attackers are also using things like LLMs to accelerate their reconnaissance and attacking and exploiting. So it's the time could really accelerate, right? I guess it's the short way of saying it seems really pressing, but it could actually accelerate even more. So it really emphasizes that need for systems that can automate the detection and response, because there's just no way you're going to get ahead of it manually. There's just too much data to sift through. I think this kind of emphasizes it as well, Crystal.
Yes. Okay. So here I want to give you some examples of the complexity that we see in cloud attacks. What attackers are using for automation, what vulnerabilities they're taking advantage of. Our threat research team has done a lot of work answering all of these questions over the last year or so. First, I want to start off with that complexity aspect of how challenging it is to look at and analyze an attack chain. We reported this with our Scarlet Eel operation earlier, end of last year. Our attacker there used an infrastructure as code service called Terraform. They were able to initial access into Terraform. They used that to pivot from the Kubernetes container into an AWS account. So they're going across multiple environments, which makes it difficult to follow them. And they were able to steal proprietary data from the customer that was attacked. So they know what they're doing. They're moving across environments. It makes it very difficult for threat detection to be able to track them as they're moving as well. That next one, free jacking, we coined that term in our Purple Urchin report. In that blog, we found a threat actor who built this massive crypto mining operation. They took advantage of 3 free trials leveraged by GitHub and things like that, CI/CD service providers. And they used those free trials to build, run, and scale their operation. This threat actor actually automated the account creation process. So you're only limited a certain amount of hours, a certain amount of compute with these free trials, of course. And as they burnt through that allotted time, they would automatically build a new account on, say, GitHub and use that to continue their operation. We actually watched, as the threat research team, this happened in near real time. We were watching accounts be created and all of the code for their operation being added to these accounts and implemented so that they could continue scaling their crypto mining operations. The other attack that we kind of coined this year as well was proxy jacking. In this case, the attacker used proxy provider services to make profit. They used a Log4j vulnerability for initial access into the victim's account. They were able to take the IP address from the victim and they sold it to the proxy service provider, and then collected the passive income from the service provider by selling the victim's IP address to unknowing users looking to obfuscate their source IP. So there's lots of examples of attackers learning. They're becoming faster. They're becoming more evasive. They're really taking full advantage of the cloud environment. They're using the same tools and applications that we are to protect ourselves, and they're finding their way in as well.
Yeah, it's I guess something to stress here too, because I saw it a lot in advisory, right? It's if you're still kind of doing that vulnerability scanning from outside your network, and that's kind of it. Like that's the gist of your approach to security. Most would just label that as vulnerability management. Hopefully, it's clear. Like it's just not going to cut it, right? Because as Crystal's pointing out, right, CVEIDs get chained, but some of those things might not be obvious externally, right? Or attackers are going to use applications and services and pieces of infrastructure in novel ways that wouldn't even make sense, right? So it doesn't look like a typical exploit of a known vulnerability. So when something like issues like Log4 shell came out, or the OpenSSL vulnerabilities, it's kind of, well, there's that initial wave of how somebody might compromise that, but then there's all the other ways they might kind of chain that together or attack business logic, right? So it becomes pretty nightmarish. And then the other big thing to remember is that, we don't exist in a vacuum, right? Most organizations are partnering with other partners and suppliers. So everybody needs to be doing this and thinking about this, right? Because that's kind of that complete software supply chain. So if there's weakness in one of the aspects of that complete system, right? Because you have to remember it is your partners and suppliers also, that becomes another way you can kind of be attacked. All right, so a little bit of how Sysdig addresses this, but I'll say that this is kind of what you should be seeking in your cloud security platform also. But as I mentioned, Sysdig is going very heavy on this runtime insights aspect because it is so critical to cybersecurity, right? We talked about these concepts throughout, but hopefully this kind of ties it together for you. We talked about that concept of posture management. Right, your security posture is critical. It's kind of, have you hardened everything pre-deployment as it's being built, and then as it's being delivered, you want to make sure it's appropriately hardened. Hardening comes from analyzing all the infrastructure as code and your configurations and all of those control planes to know, well, are my assets appropriately hardened from the get-go, right? And a lot of that is essentially shift left, right, or secure by design. And then vulnerability management is kind of in there also, right? You're testing to make sure things are relatively vulnerability free or as close to that as possible. And then it has to be continuous, right? Just like we just talked about, because new vulnerabilities are discovered, pieces of functionality change, aspects of the system change. Entitlements are going to be a moving target, right? Because those accesses for all types of identities, humans as well as machines. And then what are you doing for your security monitoring to inform threat detection and response, right? And it's not enough to just uncover an issue. Well, now you actually have to queue up the appropriate response, right? And maybe that includes your third parties, but do you have all the right data to inform that? So it's quite a bit, right? And it is kind of full life cycle. All of these things are really critical for compliance, right? We have to remember there is kind of that regulatory oversight piece, which is increasingly or is increasing. That's kind of a separate discussion, but the security industry is probably going to be undergoing some change where this becomes increasingly required, right? So we know these things to be true. We really need to be doing it as any organization in any industry, because very quickly things can be compromised, right? And can impact safety. Usually what happens as part of these discussions is that, again, organizations want to do this quickly, right? We're talking about the speed of cloud, the speed of security incidents. We need to be able to find these issues and correct them quickly. So you need to be able to detect configuration drift quickly, right, in seconds, because it can change, right? Maybe a DevOps engineer modified some code, or your software engineering team changed something in the infrastructure as code. That's going to have implications to your security posture, right? Or maybe platform ops misconfigured something in the code. We talked a lot about the vulnerability noise, right? There is this very large spectrum of CVE IDs. They're always going to be there. There's never going to be a problem finding them. The issue is what's actually in use, and then how can we reduce that noise so we can actually prioritize the things that are worth fixing. Permissions, not to beat a dead horse, but they're often bad, right? Particularly if you include the scope of machine identities, but it becomes another big attack vector for threat actors. And then you need to be able to detect the threats very quickly and in all types of environments, right? That's, as we've said, there's very mixed technology in most organizations. So SysDig is a cloud-native application protection platform provider. We've kind of talked about this at length, but runtime insights are key. We need to prioritize what is most critical so organizations can, and practitioners within the organizations can work quickly and effectively to harden, right? Prevent that code, prevent instantiations of that code from occurring again in delivery. And that happens at the application source code or infrastructure as code. You have to stop the attacks in motion with real-time detection, right? We need to be able to see these things very quickly. We can't have that kind of old world of, well, we ran all the scans, we found these 10,000 issues, and we're going to take 3 months to address it all. It's just not going to work, right? It's kind of a huge security gap and a huge window of exposure. So you need very, very quick threat detection or security gap detection. In industry, there's a concept of snapshots. I'm not going to really dive into this too much, but there's latency in doing snapshotting, and it can really greatly impact the ability to respond quickly to threats. And then end-to-end becomes super critical, right? Because no tech stack is super simple, right? It's often using different types of compute. It might be connected to different environments, right? So an application is not this small, tightly contained thing, even if it is containerized, right? It's a collection of containers and resources and networks and suppliers and partners all working together. So you really need that complete coverage or end-to-end protection. All right, with that, Crystal, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Yes, and
close this out, and then maybe we'll hit some questions.
So obviously you guys see that we had a Formula One theme here with races going on this summer. Just wanted to throw this car in here. This is actually my personal vehicle, and would like to say that I see Systig and our CNAP capabilities more like a rally racer than an F1 car. F1s are fast, they're agile, but they're not quite as rugged. Rally racers go a little hard, so I just needed to put my car in there with our race theme. There's also a link to our Runtime Insights paper. We just published this a couple weeks ago, I believe, right, Mike? So you can get a little more.
A month ago.
Okay, a month. You can go and read this and get a little bit more detail on what we tried to briefly skim over here today for you. With that, I think that's all we have. We've got a couple minutes left. We can address some questions. But I'd also like to let you guys know real quick that our threat research team is publishing their second annual threat report. That's going to be out in less than a month. If you enjoyed today's discussion, there is a ton of information in that report that is very much so related to and backs up everything that we talked about today. I'm super excited about that report. I'm sure you guys will see us. You'll probably see my face talking about it a whole bunch next month. So just want to bring that little teaser out. We have a couple questions, and I can tell you guys about the bike as well. Mike, do we want to talk about the motorcycle picture there, or should we go with some questions?
Maybe let's hit some questions. Yeah, and it's
all right.
Hopefully we hit on everything. It's impressive that Crystal didn't spill any of the beans, details in the threat report. But yeah, definitely ties into a lot of the concepts here, or reinforces them.
Okay, so here's one. This one's kind of a tough one, but we'll start with this one. Why are response times so slow for organizations?
Yeah, it's like it's almost like I would defer to my analyst's answer of it depends, but it's kind of a mix of a lot of things, right? It's that heterogeneous environments, like all the different technology stacks, and then coordinating your response across all of that. And then do you have visibility into? Do you even know it exists? And then do you have the visibility into it to know if something even happened? Most organizations really struggle to answer that. Unfortunately, that is going to really bubble up. That's some of what we're seeing with the SEC disclosure rules, right? You have to very quickly disclose when you've identified an issue. But if you're slow to identify, maybe a little wiggle room, but it's like, it can create problems for you as a publicly traded company or a company that aspires to be publicly traded. And that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? That's almost the easiest thing for the U.S. federal government to enforce, but we're also seeing this in other countries as well. Drawing a blank on the EU's equivalent of the national cybersecurity strategy, but it's going to become very critical, right? You need to secure everything up front, right? Do that hardening. They might call that shift left, but most of these things are kind of the basic security principles, right? We start to label them differently as industry or marketers, but it is very much security 101, right? Make sure that thing is deployed securely from the get-go. That's going to reduce the exposure or the ability to attack and exploit it. But you still have to monitor in runtime to know if somebody targeting you, exploiting it. But yeah, it's kind of lack of budget, right? Lack of manpower. We didn't always have.
It's hard to look for what you don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like this ability to stitch together data. Some of that comes by virtue of cloud itself. Right now, we can scale better. We can actually analyze data much faster. We can use AI to analyze the data to surface signals, or AI and ML. So there's a lot of factors to that, right? It's not so much that organizations are just poor and actively ignoring the problem. It's just we didn't have all of the right tools at our disposal, or there wasn't enough awareness on it.
So we did receive quite a few questions during our program today, and you did answer some of them via the text response, but we're going to go ahead and just tackle them again real quick. So from the top, I'm seeing This was from earlier in the session, but the 277 days includes identification and containment. How much of this is actually the breach detection time, and how does it take to be, or how are you notified?
Yeah, so this came from, like we said, IBM's cost report last year. So I just went through the report real quick and grabbed that data from there. That 277 days breaks down to 204 days for identification of a breach and 73 days to contain and or remediate. I'm not exactly sure what the terms were in there. So that's where that came from. And I know Mike had some things that he wanted to say about.
Yeah, it's. And I know we kind of got into some of it in the recorded Q&A. We've actually published a couple blogs on the SEC cybersecurity disclosure rules because it's, there's kind of state of the industry where everybody's at with that IBM report, right? And I know there was actually some scrutiny around the data set and how you measure those, how you come up with the statistics, right? And it's, I don't think it invalidates the data. I still think it's a very valuable report. And it's going to vary across industries, right? That's kind of the case with any analysis. But the SEC cybersecurity disclosure rules, it's very much, the point you determine material impact, and that might have been part of the attendees' question, right? A lot of times a breach is how people would consider a material impact, right? Because now you're talking about significant regulatory penalty. Breach technically is the loss of even just one record, if you think of in the context of GDPR and privacy impacts. So yeah, that's that one's kind of playing out more. I mean, the takeaway that Crystal and I have stressed in a lot of live events is that's kind of poor, right? It's almost a year to identify and contain any type of security incident, certainly a breach. But the SEC, for publicly traded companies, you have to disclose that within 4 business days. So we really got to shorten the time scale. And then obviously attacks are happening within 10 minutes. So yeah, hopefully that provides a little more color. But yeah, it's interesting to see. I almost would have expected remediation to take even longer. I know dwell time is very long for organizations.
Yeah, so to that note too, real quick, and I know this was pre-recorded, but our threat report did come out this year. And in there we said that cloud attacks are happening in about 10 minutes. Mandiant reported their dwell time earlier this year. So when an attacker initially accesses to when they are discovered as 16 days. And that was on premise. So much different from what IBM said. Obviously, there's some nuances in how they collect their data, but in our cloud attacks, it was only 10 minutes. 5 minutes, we started seeing attackers in cloud networks. So just so you're aware, these are probably on-premise numbers that IBM is sharing. We are recognizing that cloud attacks are being caught, but also being completed much quicker than this.
Gotcha. Thank you both. Taking this into kind of more of a looking at the basics, but do you have knowledge base of the most common misconfigurations and steps on how to remediate those?
Yeah, I can start with this. I know I shared, Sysdig has kind of a learning portal we call Learn Cloud Native. There's a lot of information there that kind of teaches you even just the basics of cloud computing and then how you might secure it. But within there's a lot of pages for serverless or containers or Kubernetes. So it's going to vary. It's kind of a hard question to answer, right? Because it's what's your architecture? What are your use cases? The guidance I often defer to, it's just from my application security background, is OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project, actually linked Sysdig, Nigel within Sysdig actually produced some research around that. So there's an OWASP top 10 project for Kubernetes specifically that kind of covers broadly what the misconfigs look like in Kubernetes, but even that has a lot of variance, right? Because it depends, are you self-managing a Kubernetes cluster? Are you using managed Kubernetes in cloud? So that answer is going to vary even just within Kubernetes, but it might be a good starting point, but that's not everything. You do have to look at Other items like CIS benchmarks or cloud providers usually have well-architected frameworks. So they're going to tell you, all right, uniqueness within like the AWS control plane. You need to also be looking out for these things. Quite honestly, too, that's Sysdig customers like that the platform can map all those things for them, because it is a lot to kind of consider, when you're spinning up anything, and then it's ephemeral, like we talked about in the session. It's very hard to know what is the right thing to do for security hygiene. And then that does also help with compliance, right? And it's going to play out in a lot of different ways. So hopefully those guidances can get you on the right track. But if you need more, certainly reach out.
Yeah, the classic lawyer answer. It depends.
With some nuance, right? Try to keep it
All right, so we've got some more questions, and I don't believe you guys have actually seen these yet, so they are fresh. Is there a possibility of hacking the secrets during the runtime? And in that case, how would you handle that?
That's a good one. I mean, I could take a stab at it, unless you're chomping at the bit, Crystal.
No, you can start. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's secrets management, secrets detection was kind of a sweet spot for me when I was doing research and advisory. I mean, there's a few ways it could play out. Often the concern was how the container runtime, how would you handle the secret to a workload as it's bootstrapping or spinning up? That was kind of one problem. But then as the workload's running, how is it exchanging secrets, right? Because it's technically a machine identity, and then it has to fetch something sensitive. Maybe it's to make a database connection. So how do you do that? It's a very deep topic. It tends to get into secrets management tooling, like something like HashiCorp Vault or CyberArk, or within the cloud providers, they have their own secrets exchange mechanisms. But you also have to look at the container runtime and the orchestration engine, which is technically another runtime. Like Kubernetes secrets is its own thing. So there's a lot of ways secrets could get exposed, right? If you're not authenticating and authorizing machine workloads appropriately. I'd say the other part that maybe is a little easier that a lot of organizations focus on is pre-runtime, right? So scanning the images and the infrastructure as code, make sure things aren't embedded there. That's kind of my quick take on that. It's a fun topic. There's a lot of good research on that front, but tricky, right? It's going to be very environment dependent.
So it looks like we've got one got a question in the same vein, but do you also provide the security scan tools for SAST, DAST, or SCA along with the recommendations?
So Sysdig specifically does not do static analysis or dynamic analysis. And for the attendees that aren't familiar, so SAST is static application security testing, DAST is dynamic application security testing. Static is looking at the application code. Dynamic is looking at the running application. For lack of a better term, fuzzing it. SCA is kind of an interesting one, software composition analysis. Although if you come from the vulnerability assessment world, it might be security configuration analysis. Sysdig does do a version of that, but it's very image centric, but also infrastructure as code. So that one's a little gray area. It kind of depends what you're looking at or thinking you need for SCA tooling. Like if you need something to scan an application binary that's sitting on a file system, then no, that's not what Sysdig does. But there are open source tools on that front. And actually, some CI/CD services also offer free scanning. OWASP actually even has its own SCA tooling. Hopefully that helps. But yeah, there's a lot. Those things tend to get more into the application code itself, much less the infrastructure and the cloud environment, but still relevant, absolutely.
Perfect. So it looks like we are at our last question, and we are about at time. So this will be our final question. So how has the adoption of cloud native technologies impacted the overall security posture of businesses, and what strategies should they employ to mitigate those associated risks?
You want to take a stab at this one, Crystal? So that's a fuzzy one. You can kind of go anyway. I mean, you could even use some of the usage report. That's
right. So security posture with the switch to cloud native. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just changing. Everything is changing, right? So we're using new tooling. The way that we're developing our cloud native environments is much different than how we develop on-premise environments and then how we maintain them. Let's see.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? It's a very broad question. I would say in some ways it's getting poorer, right? Because there's a lot, the attack surface is expanding. There's a lot more things you need to be looking at. But it's kind of, are you an optimist or a pessimist? But I would also say there's a lot more tooling that can help you discover those problems and fix them. It's just a very big learning curve. So, my mind also kind of goes to AI assistants or machine assistants. So you're seeing a lot of that now with generative AI to kind of fill in the gaps, because there is massive knowledge gaps as you're working with all this new technology. So AI can already today help a lot filling that gap and kind of reducing the learning curve. But I think it's going to get drastically better also, right? Get better forms of automation to contextualize things. But yeah, that's my short answer. That could be a webinar in itself.
Yeah, I think our defenses at this point are much more proactive, whereas defenders and offensive threat actors are kind of engaging in learning cloud environments simultaneously. On premise, maybe it was chicken before the egg. I don't know. We knew what we were doing, setting up our deployments, and then the threat actors came along afterwards. So we're kind of fighting each other at the same pace. So there's that, being proactive. We kind of understand a little bit more. The other aspect of this too, with the security struggle in the cloud, is everything in the cloud, a lot of it's open source, readily available. AWS, for example, all of their API calls and things like that are publicly available. So attackers know where to go for certain information, such as entitlement or privilege escalation. But we as defenders also know what API calls they're going to try to look at to move through our environments. As far as strategies to mitigate risk, like I said, my keyword is be proactive. Make sure you're always working on your defenses. You should always be scanning your environment for misconfigurations, for vulnerabilities, before you actually end up deploying applications. And stay up to date on intelligence, read the news, listen to webinars, threat reports, that kind of thing. All of those open source blogs and open intelligence is going to give you information on how you can better protect yourself. Most everybody provides recommendations, analytics, and things like that to be able to protect yourself from new and emerging threats.
Awesome. Well, Crystal and Michael, thank you both so much for sticking around for the full hour and answering all of the questions that we've received. We've actually gotten a couple more, but we are out of time, everyone. So I will be sending these questions over to Michael and Crystal, and they'll be able to respond after the fact. So Crystal and Michael,
appreciate everybody sending the questions. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you so much.
We will try to get to them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'd like to remind everyone that we've recorded this session, and we will be sending you an email with a link to access that recording. You can also find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. I'd like to thank Sysdig for sponsoring our program today, and to everyone in the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your attendance and your participation. And if you look at the top of the chat, you'll see a link to our post-webinar survey, or if you stick around, you'll also be funneled there after we close out. We'd love to hear your thoughts about our program today, or if you have suggestions for future topics, please let us know there. Otherwise, we hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, guys.